Good day, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our fifth event in Series 1 of the FIP Transforming Vaccination Globally and Regionally. Series 1 is around identifying transformation needs, and today's session is from smallpox to COVID-19, vaccine development and innovation. Next slide, please. Before we get going with our event today, there are a couple of housekeeping announcements I'd like to make. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed via Facebook. The recording will be freely available on our website at www.fip.org. You may ask questions using the question box provided. Please do, and we will monitor those as we go into our panel discussion. And you're very welcome to provide us with feedback on what's gone well or what we could do differently at webinars@fip.org. And of course, we will encourage you to become a member of this great federation. So a little bit about me. My name is Catherine Duggan. I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at the International Pharmaceutical Federation. I joined the organisation in June 2018, and I'm responsible for delivering the FIP vision and strategy, working with our officers, volunteers, Bureau, Exco and President, and of course with the entire profession through our member organisations, our PSMOs and our academic institutions. Super excited to be with you here today. So a little bit about this entire programme. Transforming Vaccination Regionally and Globally is the first FIP transformation outcome-based online programme of its kind, underpinned by the FIP development goals, which we launched on the 21st of September. And I would urge you all to have a look at that on our website. 21 goals, which set the plans and the ambition for the next decade and unifies us across science, practice, workforce and education. The final outcome of this programme is a historic global FIP commitment to action, which we will be signing up to in December, and that will lead us to delivery across 2021 and beyond, and the publication of a vaccination collection early next year. The series will run from September to December. Series 1 really focuses on identifying the needs of pharmacists and pharmaceutical scientist workforce to develop the vaccination transformation. And we find ourselves in the middle of Series 1 today. Series 2 events discuss the actions required to deliver on the needs in Series 1, and we align them to our development goals. So we really come along with an operational plan for 2021 and beyond. And Series 3 really focuses on our members across the 6 WHO regions and how they have or will address the actions to deliver on the commitment to transform vaccines globally and regionally. Transformation of vaccination regionally and globally webpage is transformingvaccination.fip.org. Engage with us today to help us answer the following questions, please. What single factor should be prioritised to transform pharmacy vaccination services globally and regionally? What would be the most important achievement in terms of pharmacy vaccination services in your country or your region in the next 5 years? And what should we be considering in our FIP commitment action online would help us deliver? So, on many others, our main outcome for today is to identify key needs for vaccination transformation in the pharmaceutical sciences. We've got a particularly great event planned for you today. There is an interview with Ron Piervincenzi, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the United States Pharmacopeia, USP, in the USA. And Giovanni Paletti undertakes that interview. Then I will lead a discussion with Ross, McKinnon and Giovanni at the end of the session so that we can identify key takeaways and what we need to do to transform vaccination through our sciences. But actually, possibly most importantly, what FIP can do to progress this journey. We'll follow up on the key messages in yesterday's event too. And before we get started on the video, it would be really good for us to just take a moment to introduce my colleagues, Ross and Giovanni. So if they could come on the cameras while I introduce both of you. Welcome, Ross, welcome, Giovanni. So first things first, a few words about Ross McKinnon. Ross McKinnon is currently Beat Cancer Professorial Chair in the College of Medicine and Public Health. He was previously the Foundation Director of the Flinders Health and Medical Research Institute and Dean for Research. A former Flinders School of Medicine PhD graduate, Ross joined Flinders as Director of the Flinders Centre for Innovation in Cancer in 2011, after 16 years with the University of South Australia. He stepped down from that role in 2018 to take up the role I described earlier. At the University of South Australia, Ross was the inaugural Director of the Sanson Institute and Associate Head of the School of Pharmacy and Medical Science for Research. An academic pharmacist, Ross has a broad research interest in pharmacology, pharmaceutical biotechnology, and molecular oncology areas. He is the co-inventor of patents relating to cancer chemoprevention through PharmaQuest and the discovery of novel anti-inflammatory compounds. He is a board member of the Therapeutic Innovation Australia. He's a former vice president of the FIP and is the current chair of FIP's Board of Pharmaceutical Sciences, BPS, celebrating their 50th year this year. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Catherine. Pleased to be here.
Lovely to have you. Moving on to Giovanni then. Giovanni was an associate professor of biopharmaceutics and pharmacokinetics at the James L. Winkle College of Pharmacy, University of Cincinnati. And since 2015, he has served as the FIP scientific secretary, providing leadership and strategic direction for this global federation on scientific aspects relevant to pharmaceutical sciences. Dr. Pauletti received his MS in pharmacy and a PhD in pharmaceutics from the School of Pharmacy at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland, and he's now a professor at the University of St. Louis. Following a postdoctorate fellowship at the University of Kansas, Dr. Pauletti began his academic career at Texas Tech University School of Pharmacy, Amarillo, and moved to the University of Cincinnati in 1998. He currently directs an interdisciplinary research program that centers on the design and evaluation of novel drug delivery systems to improve therapeutic applications of small molecules and biotechnology-based drugs. He's an inventor on 7 US patents and successfully enabled, in collaboration with various academic and commercial partners, preclinical and early clinical development of these proprietary drug delivery technologies. Welcome, Giovanni.
Thanks. Pleased to be here.
Delighted to have you and Ross. So, colleagues, welcoming Ronald Piervincenzi, who has served as the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Pharmacopeia since February 2014. Ron provides strategic leadership to USP's global staff of over 1,200 across 10 global sites. His transformative vision has launched key USP initiatives in bringing quality across the healthcare spectrum, upholding the USP's quality, reputation, and leadership since its founding in 1820. As Ron mentions, 2020 is the 200th anniversary of USP, an anniversary that has had to be celebrated, as with many of our events, virtually. Under his leadership, USP has modernized its operations and launched innovative new science, including in the areas of digital medicine, cutting-edge manufacturing technologies, and advanced biologics. USP is connecting to its stakeholders and customers through new initiatives, including the Quality Institute and the USP's Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Center. And many of these things are very important in the interview that Giovanni has undertaken with Ron. Ron served as a chair of the Council of Experts, the standard-setting body of 24 expert committees and over 750 standard-setting experts, and he brings more than 20 years of industry experiences across the pharmaceutical sciences, research and business strategy. Now, before we get going on our discussion, you held a really good interview, and I'd like us to watch that video, please. Interview with Ron.
Hello and welcome. Today I have the pleasure to facilitate a conversation with Dr. Ronald Piervincenzi, Chief Executive Officer of the United States Pharmacopeia, or USP for short. And this is part of FIP's digital initiative on transforming vaccination globally and regionally. Ron, welcome, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Giovanni. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you again.
So your organization, the United States Pharmacopeia, or USP, is well known to advocate for as well as actively engage in the development of public quality standards. Can you explain the main difference between quality standards for small molecule active pharmaceutical ingredients, which most of our listeners and the audience will be familiar with, and biologics, such as vaccines?
Yeah, so Giovanni, USP, we think of there being a relatively continuous range from, I would say, the simplest medicines, and I say simple from a manufacturing and production standpoint rather than from type of action, through to the very most complex, often bio-derived gene and cell therapies, things like this. And in between, you have, of course, relative transitions that are somewhat gradual. There are clear delineations between a biologic versus a chemically synthesized. But of course, as technology improves, certain things that used to be biologically synthesized, like small proteins and peptides, can now be made synthetically. And then you start to ask the question, so is that a biologic in the same sense? If the same analytic tools we use in synthesis can actually be used to monitor and monitor quality. So my first answer is, of course, that there's no bright lines. Now, that said, if you randomly choose a couple of medicines, there can be big differences in complexity, and certainly big differences in the types of techniques that one uses to assess quality and ensure quality through a manufacturing process, and then beyond into distribution chain, where there may be higher sensitivities to temperature fluctuations and such things. So what is the difference? Well, the difference as you move across that scale from a quality standpoint is that the standards are less often binary. It's less often a yes or no test, and it becomes more about systems. It becomes standards that we often call performance standards that determine the system and the process by which you're using and the consistency of that approach. Measures that indirectly determine. And then, of course, there are some direct measures. So viral products and an injectable medicine, levels of sterility. They still exist, of course, and they become particularly important for, let's say, injectable drugs. So to kind of bring it back all together, yes, there are differences. The differences are gradual. The old simple lines have started to fade away as we have more and more innovation. And then you get into a place where you move into something like a personalized medicine. And then you say, well, how do you measure the quality of a product that's just different for every patient? And then, of course, that takes it to, for today, maybe not forever, but for today, it takes you to a whole new place at the very end of that spectrum to say, well, clearly it has to be about the systems and the processes around it if each final product is unique and different.
And thank you for alluding to that. And then I think the spectrum is really getting wider and wider with the new medicines that we start to develop. And tightly connected with the topic of quality is also, as you indicated, the use of an appropriate analytical methodology that then demonstrate the compliance with the standards or the expectations that are set for safety as well as efficacy by the regulatory bodies. And can you maybe highlight some of the challenges that arise when developing analytical methodologies for vaccines specifically?
Yeah, so two things I think are unique about vaccines, or two things that make it challenging in setting standards around vaccines. The first is unique to vaccines, and that is that many vaccines are themselves evolving over time. Not all, of course, but like a flu vaccine where you have new vaccines every year. And so your standards and the way you want to measure quality is less based on the specific vaccine for the year, and rather, again, it's the processes, it's the levels of sterility, and it's quality systems that would be consistent from year to year. So that approach to quality is actually unique to vaccines, that most medicines don't change every year. That's really quite, it's quite different. But of course, that's not all vaccines. Another, I would say, challenge for the vaccine is volume, complexity, and relatively low cost. And so it's a unique mix, the vaccine marketplace. You have a complex biologic drug essentially that's selling at the price of a simple chemical medicine, and this creates fantastic opportunities for access, but also challenges for measuring quality over time. Injectable products, of course, have to be ensured with ensure sterility. But vaccines as live, especially the live attenuated vaccines, many of them actually have some variance from batch to batch and from manufacturer to manufacturer. They're not exactly identical, even if they do have the same effect. So your analytical methods have to allow and absorb a range of outcomes. When you get down to the chemical properties, even purely synthesized products do have ranges, but they're narrower, such the fact that your analytical method can allow for that within a certain range. But then your complex biologics, you have to have a more complex way to be able to allow for that range. And there's been a discussion over time, when, especially in the topic of biosimilars, as an example of why this matters. There have been biosimilars that have been approved, for example, in Europe, that are closer to what the originator that they are similar of than the originator is today, meaning it's more like what it used to be than it is today. And then because it changes over time, and so it's similar to the drug at what point in time, and when it was approved, or how it's produced today after manufacturing improvements, etc. So that's an example of what makes it more complex. Is there's no single answer to say this is the right versus this is the wrong.
So one of the hallmarks of USP's approach to the development of public quality standards throughout its 200-year history has been basically the collaborative process in which the USP staff facilitates and supports the expert committees that are comprised of volunteers coming out of industry, healthcare practitioner environment, as well as academia and regulators. And so can you maybe comment a little bit how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted this established process, which is hugely important in order to move your work as well as the work for the public forward?
Yeah, so you mentioned the history there too. Funny, a slide behind me just popped up showing our founding in 1820, just as you said the word history. That's Clara Marshall, the first woman on USP's Council of Experts, which is the body that leads our standard setting process, our volunteers. Couple of facts, and then maybe I'll share a little bit of how we operate in this very different environment that we have today with the COVID pandemic. The previous, we call our cycle, it's an internal term, it's every 5 years, USP has a new election of our external scientific leadership as well as our USP board. So it's our volunteer leaders are elected every 5 years by our convention. The previous term ended just a few months ago, so that was our 5-year term just ended. So in our last 5-year term, we had 981 expert volunteers on our expert committees and expert panels for setting our standards. So those 981 came from industry, government, practitioners across the globe. Their work is multifaceted, some in-person work, some virtual workshops, meetings in different places around the world, you name it. So that's a bit of a snapshot today. If I roll the clock back to 1820, and humor me for just a second, in 1820, the group met for forming of the USP in Washington, D.C., as it was. Then they went home, and for the next couple of years, they corresponded by mail, by US mail, to write USP's first edition, Pharmacopeia. I look at that and I think, so here we are in a brand new day having to work remotely by Zoom. But maybe it's not completely new, is it? So what was happening is people would write standards, they would mail it to the other committee members, they would each mark it up, it would come back with markings in different color ink. And then the person who received it, who first sent it out, would then create a new draft with all those feedbacks sent in and then send it once out for an approval process. So that old model from 200 years ago tells you a little bit of how we have to adapt today. How do we get the input not of, say, a dozen experts, but 981 experts over 27 different areas in which USP sets standards to 27 different committees, and each committee then has associated panels. And the answer is a little bit of everything. Asynchronous work, live action on WebExes, the ability we've had to set standards in emergency situations for COVID vaccines, for therapies that have received emergency authorization for use has been extraordinary. We've been faster than we were pre-COVID. So it's forced us to innovate in ways that's made us better and stronger, and we won't go back. We will go back to having people meet together because there's value to that, but we won't go back to not using the tools that we've been using in our standard setting process. It's made us faster, more nimble. So the short answer is it's been in that one way, and believe me, in a lot of ways it's been negative, but in that one way it's been positive.
So like, in many other cases, we have seen that this pandemic has put us under pressure to also rethink some of the processes that we do, and gives us also some opportunities to really advance and be more innovative in the way we work together. And it's great to hear that USP has adapted to that model over the last 200 years. So that's really nice.
Yeah, a lot of organizations I've spoken to often said, we had these three things we've always been saying, but there were reasons why we couldn't, and suddenly we had to. So it wasn't necessarily you invented something new, it's just that you implemented it for real and quickly. And some of it worked quite well. I know that some areas it's harder. In academia, for example, there's some value, but there's also a lot of loss if you were to move to a totally virtual environment. And so it's not all good news. We've just been fortunate, specifically when it comes to standard setting and engagement of volunteers around the world. We've been able to make really quite take quite advantage of digital connectivity.
Now, one of the things that might be a little bit difficult under the current situation with COVID is the support and stability of our supply chain. So we have seen a lot of significant vulnerability of the supply chain of general pharmaceutical products, and that includes vaccine. When you think about the standard vaccines, WHO published a report that the normal vaccination rate has gone down by 50% or even more in certain countries because the products were not available. And that is a big concern with regards to the overall health globally. And what are the learnings from these disruptions that you think that we need to address in the future in order to limit some of the risk to the patients in the future?
Yeah, so it has been a wake up. I think for those who pay close attention to the topic, it isn't particularly anything new, but it has brought it right to the surface, even to the broad public, which is not typically a conversation you have in public media. The vaccines usage, as you described, treatments for malaria, TB have tailed off for the first time. They've been, improving for decades, and for the first year, there's been a setback. There's also been some reactions from donor organizations to try to offset that, but you raise a really good point. First thing we noticed was there wasn't enough information, and so starting now, I don't exactly know, but about 4 months ago, maybe 5 months ago, we started a new initiative with a pretty big expenditure of our time, thousands of hours, to create a map of the global supply chain of all medicine, or as close to that as we can get. All medicine, where the API comes from, finished doses, where they then get shipped from what country to what country, and with thousands of medicines in many thousands of formulations across 200 countries, it is an enormous, enormous sets of data. And of course, none of the data is perfect, and connecting them is even more challenging. So it's been many-month effort with ourselves. We work with some external partners, and we have the first results coming from that. What's the key learning? Ultimately, you have to get to a solution. So I'll skip the middle part and I'll get to the, so what do we do? The answer is, to date, all the work has been at the very front end, the manufacturer themselves. And the rest of the supply chain has kind of just been along for the ride. And for the first time, I'm hearing, and I point to pharmacy as probably the most important, but not the only, but clearly the most important, in the middle of that supply chain to play a stronger role. And they're asking the right questions. So large pharmacy organizations, for example, asking, well, how do we make our purchases in a way that helps ensure resilience? How do I play a part? And it's a legitimate question, meaning I don't know where I could buy these medicines. I don't know what risks are there, so I'm not really sure how I can then mitigate those risks. But the first, asking the question is the first step. The second step is not closing down, but opening up. So not becoming a nationalistic and trying to solve it for yourself and let the rest of the system fall apart, but to absorb the fact that having a complex global supply chain is a strength more than it is a risk. Having many countries that manufacture a medicine means any problem in any one can be offset by somebody else. And so I think our perspective here is make sure we don't step in the wrong direction, use the data to inform players, hospital providers, perhaps patients, but at least hospital providers and pharmacies to be able to play a more active role in mitigating risk. And with that, as you kind of work upstream, it provides opportunities for high quality manufacturers to win and to show that their high quality and resilient supply is worth purchasing. And that creates a competitive pressure to do a good job. And I think that ultimately will make the system stronger, for, sustainably stronger.
And now you mentioned pharmacy, and pharmacists in particular have the opportunity to also contribute with their compounding activities to some of the or react to the shortages that we experience. What is your general comment about the utilization of compounding in those particular situations where you have drug shortages?
Yeah, well, we've seen really good actions. It's gone a little bit under the radar, which is probably what happens when the system reacts well. No one pays much attention to it because it does its job. But compounding has played an active role in many parts of the world, including the US, but not only the US, in meeting special filling gaps, especially for medicines that are most critical, that have gone into shortage. And that's current. This isn't like it's past, it's happening today. One challenge, and this is where the compounding cannot help, is when it backs up to the front end of the supply chain, to the API or the associated materials that are causing the manufacturing problem, then the compounding is not a solution. And so the compounding works really well when the problems are in the middle, shortages in a local region or certain kind of dosages. It's an excellent choice. So it's not a panacea, of course. What we've seen is that the compounding has gone beyond what people typically think about. So things like hand sanitizers and that's actually also important. OTC products. It's not only prescription medicines that can suffer from shortages. And then the final part, and this is where I think pharmacy is in collaboration with many others, is they're looking for clever ways to address the things that are chronically in shortage. So usually low cost, high volume. They're medicines that most people consider pretty boring to think about. Saline. It's not, people don't think of it as a medicine, but it is. It's a treatment. And sterile saline has been in chronic shortage around the world for years. And so some people are coming together and just creating nonprofit entities to be able to produce these products and just have them on the marketplace, and pharmacy is playing a leading role in that. So I think there's like a whole basket of services, some about you as a purchaser, others perhaps even as a provider, and then a third is maybe making choices on behalf of your patients to ensure them higher resilience.
Now, in anticipation of a successful vaccine, we also learn more about the challenges that we would foresee with regards to the distribution of a vaccine in a more equitable fashion. How do you think pharmacy can support this particular aspect?
Yeah, the equitable is the key. There's always challenges when you try to produce something for the entire world's population. So maybe I'd say it goes without saying, it doesn't. We have to talk about it, but that's clear. But there's a second aspect which concerns us, which is that the reality is that there are parts of the world that will have access a lot faster, that they'll have more reliable access, and they'll have access to the right kind of quality. And we know from history of every medicine products that others, especially in lower income countries, are not going to have those opportunities. They won't receive the medicine as quickly, in this case, a vaccine. When they do receive it, will it be assured at the same level of quality and expectation? Will they be receiving the top product, or will they be receiving what's left at the end of a process? If the vaccine requires multiple doses, will they have a system in place locally to make sure that those doses are being delivered of the right vaccine at the right time? These are very unsure, and they do worry us. When medicines are in shortage, countries get very conservative. They close down their own supplies. They don't allow it out until there's enough for their own population. And most countries in the world don't produce medicines, are going to just be stuck waiting and hoping with very little power. There is good news also, of course. So I'm sharing all the bad news. There is good news. The ability to have multiple vaccines that are effective, maybe they're not identical, but that are effective over time, and we're learning as they're in use, will give more access to more. I hope that donor organizations get involved, and I believe that they are, and they can play a meaningful role, especially not so much necessarily even in the purchasing directly of the vaccines, but in the systems required to distribute and have them approved and locally. And then help to local governments and healthcare providers, especially pharmacies, to be able to absorb that volume of medicine distribution. It's unusual. It's extremely unusual in this case. We're talking about basically everybody in the world. It's been hard enough to say, how do we vaccinate, against a infectious disease in certain countries in the world? That's been a multi-decade challenge. And here we're saying, can we solve multi-decades in a single year around the world for everybody? And the answer is probably no, but we have to have, we're going to be doing this for a longer time. And I think what we're most concerned about is it's very easy to trade off on quality. It's fixed. Your amount of money you have to spend, the quantity of your people that need the vaccine, these are fixed parameters. And unfortunately, one thing that can waver is expectations of quality. Well, we can't get the vaccine that we know works, but maybe we can buy that vaccine that we don't know. We're not really sure of the integrity of that system. It doesn't meet international standards, but maybe it's better than nothing. And we worry about that because it might not be better than nothing. It might be worse than nothing. And it may give a false sense of safety or safety from the virus that you don't have. So I think there's actually a lot of risks. If the shortages are substantial, then it creates an incentive towards poor quality or even counterfeit medicines.
We arrived at my last question for today, and it relates to USP. So as a member of FIP, what are the strategies that you think our global federation should explore in order to support equitable access to vaccines worldwide?
Yeah, I think FIP, one of its strongest tools is advocacy. That it's remarkably poorly understood, or it gets ultra simplified, that the pharmacy community, how important the role the pharmacy community plays, and in places in the world where a very strong pharmacy community exists, or pharmacy, I would say, system, you have much lower substandard and counterfeit medicines. You have a check, you have a professional who's able to help prevent these things from happening. This is going to be ultimately super important right now. And this is a chance to really strengthen the role of pharmacy in all countries in the world, not just lower income countries, but middle and high income countries as well. And to play that role, to be informed about what expectations are, especially around the vaccines. Individual patients are not equipped with the tools, even if they have the knowledge, they're not equipped with the tools to be able to know if the vaccine they're getting is what it should be. So they rely on the first contact they have, which is most likely a pharmacist, even as most likely a pharmacist to be delivering the vaccine. So that's my advice, is to keep up the discussion about the importance of that step, the role of the pharmacist in it. And it could be a strengthening opportunity for pharmacy, especially when it comes to trust. It's already one of the most trusted professions, and this could be a real boost to that trust.
Thanks so much. Greatly enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to future interaction between FIP and USP. Thanks.
Thank you, Giovanni. We're very proud to be a member.
Thank you so much, Giovanni, for that. So I welcome now Ross and Giovanni to our panel discussion. Welcome, Ross. Welcome, Giovanni. What a pleasure to join you both and consider some of the broader issues that have emerged around science in both yesterday's and today's events. To remind everyone, at yesterday's event number 1.4 in the transformation program, Ross was featured interviewing scientists and vaccine experts Colin Pouton, who is a professor of pharmaceutical biology at Monash Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences in Australia, and Nikolai Petrovsky, founder and CEO of Vaccine Australia. And we've all just heard Giovanni's interview with Ron Piervincenzi. So I have some questions for both of you as panelists, starting with you, Ross. What are your three key takeaway messages from your interviews with Colin and Nikolai?
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Giovanni. I really enjoyed the interview with Ron, and thanks to whoever put up the photo of me that's about 10 years out of date. I'm really enjoying that. My three take-home messages from the interviews yesterday, I think the first one I would highlight was optimism, which I thought both of the interviewees, and just highlighting one of those interviewees was from academia and the other one was very much an industry-focused interviewee. Both, I think, exhibited optimism about the possibility of a vaccine in the relatively near future. There was nothing unrealistic, of course, but I would take that as one of the take-home messages. The second take-home message was the clear emphasis on safety, and the fact that The accelerated development of COVID vaccines, we're really talking about quite a remarkable acceleration of the normal vaccine development process, a process that normally can take sort of many, many years. And we're talking about vaccines that are relatively late in phase 3, within less than 12 months of the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what has been sacrificed is certainly not safety. What has been sacrificed is perhaps the finances of the companies involved, and also utilization of existing data and things like that as a bonus. But there's no compromise of safety, and I think the interviewees expressed that sort of quite clearly, that safety is absolutely paramount. And when we're talking about vaccines that are going to be utilized in potentially billions of people, clearly even a very minor or relatively low incidence side effect is a major negative. The third thing that I thought was really striking was the sheer diversity of the technology platforms that are in use or are in sort of development, and the diversity of the companies that are actually involved, of companies and academia that are involved in the development of the various vaccines. And what that really sort of means is that we're going to have multiple vaccines emerging, multiple vaccines at different stages of development, multiple situations of rollout of those vaccines, and Ron's sort of comments were very pertinent there. But the issues that are going to arise for the different vaccines at different stages of development are quite different. The issues that are going to arise for the various companies are quite different. And in some cases, we're talking about companies that have never actually produced vaccines successfully, or companies that have never produced vaccines in the volumes that we're sort of talking here. So I found that sort of diversity of technology and companies quite striking through the interview. So I think for me, optimism, safety, and the diversity of development sort of programs were the three striking things that I really found from the interviews that I conducted.
Thank you, Ross. I think they're very well made. And I really took the notion of safety. We can't compromise that, given that there's a bit of a rush on everybody in order to get a vaccine or the vaccines. So that was really well made. Giovanni, what are your three messages from the interview that we just saw with Ron?
Thanks, Catherine. I think building on what Ross said, the realization of the diversity of the different vaccines that we will most likely look at in the future, it gives some opportunity as well as some challenges to deal with. In one aspect, I think that was very clear from Ron's discussion is the focus on quality and the maintenance of quality. And because of the diversity, the quality assurance can be quite different. Ron mentioned that some of the vaccines, they're quite diverse in terms of the chemical composition, and the maintenance of the quality standards would be more complex. Whereas if you look at an mRNA vaccine, the aspects would be quite different as compared to a life attenuated virus, for example. The other point that I believe he made also very forcefully is the reliance on the supply chain. With the opportunities of multiple vaccines, there is certainly a high demand for vaccines, and if we are not very careful in assuring a safe supply chain, this can go quickly out of hand by getting access to inappropriate materials that are sold as vaccines, and the appropriate consequences even from a safety or from an efficacy perspective. And probably the last point, I think, which is nice for FIP to hear is the role of the pharmacist and the important aspect of advocacy from FIP for the information that is distributed to the population. There are so many issues that are now distributed regarding vaccine developments, and some of them are scientifically completely inaccurate. And it is important that we have a qualified person in the middle that helps the public to understand what's scientifically correct and what's not. And the pharmacist, as a scientifically trained person, is certainly capable of doing that.
Thanks so much, Giovanni. I agree with you. I think there's something about the complexity of the supply chain in all of this that we're going to need to unpick in the next few minutes in our discussion. And being that arbiter, that trusted person in the middle who's able to give some advice on emerging and evolving evidence in these days. As pharmacists and pharmaceutical scientists, we're comfortable when we know the truth. We're less comfortable when the evidence is shifting as we find it some of these days, but we need to be the ones that patients and the public trust with that. Thank you so much both, and thank you for those interviews. I really enjoyed them. My next question for both of you, and I think I'll keep it in this order as well. Ross, what do you think the implications for vaccine development, for pharmaceutical sciences in general, really building on what you've just mentioned, but in general, what's our implications for our science? And then the same to you, Giovanni.
It's a really, really interesting question. I actually think one of the most interesting things to emerge from what's happened in the last 6 to 12 months is actually the compressed time frame of development of these vaccines. I think actually challenges the way that we develop therapeutics, the way that we develop drugs, the way that we do our pharmaceutical science. And I think it's, as I said, safety was not compromised, but there were quite dramatic acceleration, if you like, of some of the processes around drug discovery and develop, or therapeutic discovery and development that have happened in the last 12 months. And whilst we are talking about a fairly unique circumstance, I wonder about the long-term impact of that acceleration on the overall processes of pharmaceutical science. Now, what we're seeing is a multidisciplinary effort. We're seeing, expertise being drawn in from all sorts of areas. And I think one of the challenges for pharmaceutical science moving forward is how we, as a discipline, draw on all of those disciplines, draw on all of that expertise to actually come up with a cohesive sort of concept, if you like, of what pharmaceutical science is moving forward. And I think one of the challenges will be how we actually formulate that as a discipline moving forward, but also what are the positive changes that we can draw from the accelerated programs that we can implement sort of in the future. So I think it's challenging, but I think it's also quite an exciting time.
I agree with you. I think for most of us, we have to take what the positives have been during this strange year and try and build on them and not regress back. Giovanni, what are your thoughts on the implications for our sciences in general?
I also want to start with the positive, which is really the tremendous increase in collaborative activities that we have seen. Looking at the number of companies that are engaged in the development of vaccines, it hasn't been done in the past. You were lucky if you have at least 2 programs on the same disease state in terms of vaccine development. Now, we started out with over 100, have probably pared it down to currently about 40 of the more advanced developments in clinical stages. So that's really a great opportunity. And how do we sustain that in the future? That's going to be the question that probably pharmaceutical scientists will have to address. The collaboration is great, and with that there will be some learnings in terms of what works and what doesn't work. We also have seen tremendous financial support of these development activities, and can we continue similar programs with less financial support that come in? It's another question. Another point I believe I want to mention is, how do we deal with information that is collected out of these programs? I think Nikolai mentioned, or it was Colin, that it is important that we also share some of the findings that did not work in our approach to develop a new vaccine, because that's one of the limitations, that you start to see companies repeating failures because they were not aware of some of the failures from other companies. So how do we do that in a way that preserve some of the intellectual properties of some of the companies that have spent significant effort in one direction and then didn't get to the final goal. So those are probably the opportunities as well as the limitations that we have to deal with in the near future. But it's good to be challenged as a profession to deal with that, because it can only be an advancement for the future.
Can I just support what Giovanni said there, particularly around the finance issues, that we are talking about 180 vaccine development programs, of which about maybe 10 to 20 will be substantially funded to the level of phase 3 funding. So we're talking about an enormous volume of pharmaceutical science that's taking place that won't actually be funded long term and won't actually go anywhere. And trying to, when I say go anywhere in terms of the development of an actual product. So harnessing that, I think, is one of the real challenges as well, as to how we harness all of that activity that can't be funded. Obviously, there's more funding going to go into the COVID-19 programs and the normal sort of development programs, but there's still an enormous amount of work there that's going to be sitting there without funding.
Yeah, that's probably, well, I'm going to come on to the urgency thing. So Ross, hold that thought and think about how we could do this. I really love not only the positives, but the reality that's coming out of our discussion today. So not just about, oh, it's great to collaborate, but we've got to learn from what hasn't quite gone right so that we can really take the leaps that you were talking about, Ross. So a very nice interplay from both of you. So the next question, Ross, I think you started that very, very well, is what, in your opinions, are the most urgent needs in our sciences? Funding, I presume, will be one of the most urgent, but if you had another that you could add to that mix, and then I'll come to you, Giovanni.
I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, I think the science is there. We have a lot of technology platforms that are under development. We don't know the proof will be in the development of the products. We're talking about a lot of technologies in vaccine development for COVID-19 that haven't actually successfully produced a vaccine as such. So I think the missing dimension here is just how successful some of these new technologies will be when it gets to the critical area of development, which is in phase 3. So the missing element really at the moment is the data that will emerge from phase 3. And subsequent to that, I think the missing element is just how we scale up some of these new technologies. Should they be the ones that produce the vaccines that we're most interested in? If the technologies that produce the vaccines that sort of look most successful in terms of immunogenicity, in terms of tolerability and so on, then we know how to scale. We know how to scale up inactivated vaccines, or we know how to scale up attenuated vaccines and so on. But we don't really know how to scale up some of these newer technologies. So for me, that's the missing link at the moment.
Still in an experimental concept, if you like. Yeah, we've got evidence of what we've done before, but the new stuff, yeah.
That's right. It's quite clear that the vaccines that got into clinical trials earliest were some of the newer technologies. And that's because pharmaceutically, they're relatively simple compared to some of the older vaccines. By pharmaceutical, I mean, in order to generate a product that is suitable for sort of initial clinical trials, it's quite simple. So they got a bit of a jump in terms of development. And they're the ones that are in sort of late stage phase 3. There are other sort of vaccines in late stage, but it's going to be really interesting to see just what phase 3 data emerge from these newer technologies. And as I said, how we actually scale those up.
Yeah, really, really good. So Giovanni, what's your opinion on the most urgent one or two issues for our science?
I think I want to come back to the importance of access to data that is generated as part of all these efforts. We tend to be very efficient in generating a lot of data that we actually don't share among the scientific community, and that leads to inefficiencies in the process. With the expectation in this particular case for a COVID-19 vaccine, we're forced to compress the timeline. And that what Ross mentioned, pharmaceutical sciences has been developing strategies for various changes of processes over the years that we understand how to do it, but not at that particular time frame that we're currently working on. And so there is the challenge that we need to figure out where can we accelerate some of these processes without leading to some harm down the line, because that can be tremendous damage to the credibility of a vaccine if it turns out that we're going to start to administer that in a larger scale to people and suddenly see some safety issues that were not appropriately tested earlier.
It's a really big issue, isn't it? There's a real appetite out there. The governments and our policymakers are really driving us to get a quick solution. And we need a solution quickly because of our economies and the health of our nations. But if we go too quickly and we don't balance up the whole issue, as Ross has mentioned, about a smooth supply chain, and as you've mentioned, Giovanni, about safety, you can imagine we're going to end up with probably more problems than we predicted. It's complex.
Can I just add one other thing,
oh, please do, Ross.
Catherine, which is that I think one of the other challenges from a scientific and a clinical perspective is just what it will look like in terms of a successful vaccination outcome. I mean, how many vaccines will actually be involved in that solution? What will the dosing regimes look like? Because that will influence the rollout, that will influence the access. You know, if we require 2 doses of every vaccine and boosters and so forth, if the vaccines are simply attenuating disease rather than sort of providing sterilization, what it actually looks like, I think, is the other missing dimension.
Yeah, yes, it is indeed, isn't it? It's like a missing piece of the jigsaw, or the central piece of the jigsaw is still missing, should we say. Yeah, it's complex. Now, I'm going to lead you both into our final question before I round up and then introduce the next session. Giovanni, I'm going to start with you on this one. When you interviewed Ron, you asked him how FIP can support the vaccination transformation. I've got the same question for you. Actually, as Scientific Secretary of FIP, how do you see FIP supporting this? But also, how do you see FIP and BPS and the wider agenda supporting our science in this?
So I think FIP is a unique situation to have access to a broad network of channels to actually then put in the right information, and those channels will amplify the message to the general population. I think we have to be very adamant in terms of the advocacy of appropriate information disseminated to our member organizations, and throughout those member organizations we have a chance to reach a lot of people, so ultimately the global population will be informed with appropriate scientific information.
Thank you, Giovanni. As our new chair of BPS, Ross, working closely with Giovanni and myself and all other officers across FIP, what would be your vision for how FIP can support vaccination transformation, with particular focus on pharmaceutical science?
So I think the first thing I would say is I totally agree with what Giovanni just said. That's why he's our scientific secretary. He's on the ball, I think. Advocacy without adequate information, without adequate education is not particularly helpful. Informed advocacy is helpful. And I think the role of the pharmaceutical sciences in FIP in relation to vaccination is really to ensure that our profession, as it advocates, is informed, and that requires an ongoing process because the technology is evolving. The nature of the pandemic is such that there's new information all the time. The public trust is absolutely essential if we are to ensure adequate rollout, adequate access, and all of those things. So I think for us, it's about informing the advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And keeping that trust front and center. One thing I will say on reflection to both of you is that never really before has pharmaceutical science had such a focus in public awareness. You know, I hear family and friends of mine talking about issues to do with pharmaceutical science, and I've been in the profession for many years. This has really heightened their awareness of it. Trusted information is what they need. Thanks so much.
Yeah, the language of pharmaceutical science has become public.
Yes, it really has. And we need to keep that up. We need to not dumb the language down, but to demystify things in an appropriate way. And really, we're going to need everybody across FIP to do that. But this is BPS really is front and centre, our Board of Pharmaceutical Sciences and our experts around the table there. Thank you. Thank you both. Actually, thank both of you for taking the time to be with us today. We know that we're really busy with PSWC as well, our Pharmaceutical Science World Congress, which is also ongoing right now virtually. And we're really delighted, I'm really delighted to have you both leading BPS for us during the rest of 2020 and beyond. Welcome, Ross. I would also encourage colleagues attending this session today to view and download the PSWC events and attend those sessions or even download them in the future. Thanks both. Any closing remarks before I move to the next event and close the session? Giovanni?
Well, I think we have to take COVID as an opportunity, not as a limitation. And as we heard from the experts in those various interviews, there's plenty of opportunities that we need to take care of and that we should look forward to. But at the same time, we need to assure that we are part of the appropriate informed messaging that we as an organization are distributing to our members.
Great message there, Giovanni. Ross, any closing remarks?
Yeah, and the closing remark from me is simply that we all know that how critical pharmaceutical science is in terms of changing healthcare around the world. I think what a COVID pandemic does is it highlights that to the broader community. And I think it is a rare opportunity for us to actually excel and show just how powerful pharmaceutical science is and how important it is for the healthcare of our communities.
Yeah, very, very powerful message there, Ross. And absolutely every single word you've said there is true. It's an opportunity for us, even though these are sobering times. Thank you both again so much. So if I have the next slide, please, I can then ask my colleagues who are in attendance to join our next event, which is on the 14th of October at 2 o'clock Central European Summer Time. That episode focuses on workforce and education needs, the focus on our undergraduate education, where panelists with expertise in education and workforce development will seek to discuss the integration of vaccinations into undergraduate courses, with a premise that every graduate pharmacist is able to vaccinate on day one of practice. Discuss. Other discussions will focus on course development and accreditation, considerations for regulations around provision of vaccinations by graduating pharmacists, really linking very much into some of the concepts that both Giovanni and Ross have mentioned. The infrastructure needed within the existing workforce to deliver these experiential contacts for our graduating pharmacists, so that we're not just leaving them to learn from textbooks. I encourage you all to register online at transformingvaccination.org. And once again, Ross and Giovanni, thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everybody for participating. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.